Greetings and welcome to the Psych 487 lecture on Antecedents to Behaviorism in my Capstone History and Systems Psychology course here at Boise State University. So let's get to it. Antecedents to Behaviorism. And so we're making the transition here from the ends of functionalism and that school of thought in psychology to the beginnings of behaviorism. And so that's the transition we're in here, from Wundtian psychology to structuralism to functionalism. And that was really, as historians will characterize it, more evolutionary than revolutionary. It evolved over time. There were, sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle changes. It was really more considered a deliberate, actually, it was more considered a chipping away than a deliberate attack. It wasn't like a revolutionary war where all of a sudden you're going to declare that the other side is wrong and we're going to go to battle over it and things like that. It was just kind of a general changing over time. Well, as you can kind of see by the setup here, that's about to change with regards to the onset of behaviorism. In 1913, a revolution breaks out within American psychology, and there is war declared against the establishment. It's not smooth, it's not sudden, it's very traumatic, there are no compromises, there's no, we're just going to ease into this, and this is going to be the next thing in psychology. The war is led by, you see a picture of John B. Watson, who received his PhD at the University of Chicago. He's going to spend some time at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Eventually, he's going to leave psychology in a bit of disgrace and then become very famous with regards to advertising in Madison Avenue for the remainder of his life. And so there's all kinds of deep, rich stories about John B. Watson that we really won't get into here today, including biographies that have been written about his life that are available. So anyway, this antecedent, this transition from Wundtian psychology, structuralism, functionalism into behaviorism, now it's not an easy transition. It's a definite break. It's war is declared. This is the Revolutionary War, not the evolution of psychological thought, at least in the United States. So just to lay the groundwork, the tenets, the basic beliefs, the fundamental principles of behaviorism. Behaviorism is the science of behavior, which is totally objective, dealing with observable behavioral acts, which could be described in terms of stimulus response. And so if you read a little bit about, or you get online and you look at the materials that are available from this era, you'll see SR, like with a little arrow between the S and the R. And so this was called SR psychology all the time. It was about stimulus and response. So you can see things like classical conditioning, with the UCS and the CS, and operant conditioning with the behavior and the consequence really fit in quite nicely here. In fact, we're going to go over both of those concepts prior to this lecture being concluded. And so the behaviorists, at least the ones who are what we would call strict behaviorists, are going to discard all mental concepts and terminology. So think about this. What I've got here, this first little sub-bullet here. So for psychology and for the study of human behavior, there's no images or imagining. We don't study the mind. We don't study we don't study consciousness. Now, behaviorists at the time would not deny that these things exist, imagery or the one's mind or consciousness. They would just say it's not the purview of psychology. Psychologists, as scientists, do not study those topics. They study things that are directly observable and quantifiable. And so for behaviorists, they define away much of what makes a human being a human being. And for them, that's going to be fine. You'll see in a later lecture that that's going to be a criticism of behaviorism, that you just kind of define away what we think of today is really, in some aspects, the bulk of psychology. And so again, leading up to behaviorism, there's no mind, there's no imagination, there's no consciousness. And I like this quote by John B. Watson, 1929. Consciousness, quote, has never been seen, touched, smelled, tasted, tasted, or moved. It is a plain assumption just as unprovable as the old concept of soul, close quote. And so you can kind of get a sense of where folks are going to be going with regard to behaviorism for this kind of quote. This isn't some, oh, we're a big happy family, our arms are wide open, come on in. This is not possibilianism, to reference a video that we watched in class a couple of weeks ago. This isn't possibilianism at all. This is my house, and these are my rules, and if you don't like it, take your bat and ball and go home. And so behaviorism is going to be very revolutionary in that regard in American psychology. All right, so another figure that's going to play prominently, especially with regard to what we would call now operant conditioning within behaviorism and within psychology, really, is E.L. Thorndike. He lives from 1874 to 1949. He also, too, is a proponent that psychology must study behavior, and really behavior is the only thing that we're going to be studying. So higher mental processes or cognition or problem solving really aren't the purview of psychology unless we can see it, taste it, touch it, feel it, smell it kind of thing. And so his notion, one of his grand contributions, and in fact we're going to have Thorndike's law of effect, and there's not a lot of laws in psychology like there are in physics or in chemistry, is connectionism. And so when we learn about the environment, connections are made between stimuli in the environment or the stimulus response. And you can see here at the bottom of the screen where you'll see that little SR like I mentioned previously. And so stimulus response. And so for humans, he called it associationism, was the connection between ideas. And so you study for a test and you get a good grade, and all of a sudden studying gets connected for human beings as a method by which to have desired performance on an exam. And so we can observe someone studying, we can watch them, we can calculate the number of minutes or hours one studies, we can count the number correct on a multiple choice test, and we can make those connections or associations. So association is going to be the term that's going to be associated. I was going to say connotated, but that seems a little awkward. It's going to be associated. Associationism is associated with humans, and connectionism is going to be the term that we'll typically use with animals. So connectionism was the connection between the situations and responses for animals. And again, we'll see this SR psychology. So it's all about stimulus response. And so this classic notion of, if I can control your environment, if I can control what stimuli a child is exposed to, I might be able to control the conditions under which the behavior emerges, and the learning, the traits, the qualities, the characteristics that the child grows up with into adulthood. And so SR psychology and behaviorism is really going to be the dominant system of psychology pretty much from the 1920s, maybe a little bit earlier, to the 1960s, and maybe into the mid-1960s at the very latest. And so it's going to have a good 40-year, 2 solid generation run within American psychology. And so just to kind of give you a little bit of a notion and a preview of where we're headed as we're leading up to behaviorism with our antecedents to behaviorism here, Thorndike is going to be interested in very much a quantitative measure of learning, and you can see where this comes out of antecedent traditions. Harken back to Galton, harken back to other folks, Cattell and Dewey, who came along and wanted to measure behavior and get scores and numbers, be quantitative, and apply statistical methods. Well, here we have the same tradition continuing with regard to an antecedent to behaviorism and E.L. Thorndike. And so again, look at the quantitative abilities we have here. We can count the number of wrong behaviors. And so one definition of learning is that over repeated trials, learning can be evidenced by a decrease in errors. And what happens here is that we don't have to ask the participant whether or not they're learning or not. We don't have to ask them, do you think you're learning? Do you think you've studied well for this test? What we can look at from a psychological perspective is the number of errors. Did the number of errors decrease over time? And if so, we could operationally define then what we mean by learning as a decrease in the number of errors. We can also think about this with regards to time. And so if we timed the amount of minutes that it took to memorize a list of words or to solve some sort of task or to read a paragraph in a textbook, and I come back later and I see that the amount of time decreases, we might define that as evidence of learning as well. And so we now start to what the behaviorists would like to do is to externalize these notions. And so I can study learning as long as I operationally define it in such a way where I get measurable scores. And that's going to be the preference of psychologists, not only for a long time, but it really continues to this day. There are certainly folks who emphasize qualitative data, the richness of verbal report data, but really psychology, for the most part, tends to be a very quantitative discipline. We want to apply our statistical methods to analyze the results of our studies, at least for the most part. And so to give you just a little sampling of the type of labeling and terminology that Thorndike would have been using, when he talked about positive reinforcers, reinforcers versus punishers, that kind of thing, stimulus response situations, behaviors either get stamped in or stamped out. And so they either get reinforced, which means they get strengthened, or they get punished, which means they get weakened. And so behaviors that are stamped in are responses which lead to success and pleasure. Behaviors which are stamped out lead to the lack of success, unsuccessful response tendencies. And the behaviorists, to be honest, are going to be very specific about this type of language. They're going to be very precise, and they're going to want operational definitions that are difficult to argue with. And so one of the contributions you can see already from behaviorism is that it's going to lend a level of precision in measurement within psychology that had been unseen up until this point in psychology. So Thorndike's law of effect, again, I mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of laws in psychology. We've got a boatload of hypotheses, a plethora of theories, but an absence of laws as compared to, say, laws of gravity or laws of motion that you might see in physics or laws that you might see in chemistry. So anyway, Thorndike's law of effect goes like this. Responses that are associated with pleasant consequences tend to be repeated, while those associated with discomforting consequences tend to be eliminated. Now, one of the things that even drove behaviorists crazy is that they didn't care for the looseness of the language. And so pleasant versus unpleasant, because, for most of us, chocolate can be very pleasant. But if you're sadly allergic to chocolate, and when I say sadly, I do mean sadly, if you were sadly allergic to chocolate, then chocolate wouldn't be a reinforcer. Chocolate would not be what we would call a pleasant consequence in the parlance. And so behaviorists are going to spend a great deal of time trying to get out of these circular definitions and try to be very definitive what they mean by responses associated with pleasant consequences tend to be repeated, whereas those associated with discomforting consequences tend to be eliminated. Another big contributor as we're leading to our antecedents to behaviorism and the formal onset of behaviorism in America in the 1920s, actually late 19 teens into the 20s, would be Ivan Pavlov, who lived from 1849 to 1936. You can see artist rendition of a painting there of Pavlov, born in Russia. He enrolls in seminary, so he's going to become a priest. He reads Darwin. He drops out. Don't make any associations there. Not really quite sure what that all means. And Pavlov begins his study of animal physiology. So Ivan Pavlov's not a psychologist. I mean, he actually goes to medical school. He's trained in medicine, starts studying animal physiology, and he really covers three major research areas in his very long career. And you can see those sub-bullets there on your screen at the very bottom. Functions of the nerves and heart, primary digestive glands, to which he wins the Nobel Prize in 1904, and conditioning. And so you and I really know about Ivan Pavlov's career in that third bullet point under conditioning. But note, and by the way, and Pavlov is going to study conditioning for about 20 years before he, probably actually more than 20 years. I think he's going to have his first publication in about 1927 when he talks about what he would call unconditioned and conditioned responses and the UCS, UCR, CSCR kind of situation. And similar to the story with let's see, of Darwin and Wallace, a guy named Twitmeyer is going to come along in the 1920s and challenge what Pavlov has been studying for about 20 years. And he will actually, Twitmeyer that is, will prompt Pavlov to publish his studies perhaps even a little bit earlier than he wanted to, because again, there is something to be about being first, especially with these big, broad ideas that continue to influence psychology to this day. So think about that. And so Ivan Pavlov has a huge career. In fact, he has the career to the extent to which by 1903, 1904, he's actually awarded the Nobel Prize. And then he starts studying conditioning. And then he starts studying the things that you learned about in your learning chapter in your general psychology textbook, or that you probably studied to a great extent if you took our learning course here at Boise State. And so that's an amazing contribution after he'd already won the Nobel Prize in 1904. So this is an artist rendition of a setup of a dog in a harness. And so you may be familiar with this from your learning course or even remembering it from a discussion in general psychology. I'm not going to go over this too much, but Pavlov mostly did his digestive research with dogs, and he notices some things in the turn of the century, 1902, 1903, that actually gets him curious about why do the dogs start to salivate while the food is being brought into the facility, even before the food arrives. The dog can hear these footsteps, the dog starts to salivate, and so Pavlov is quite ingenious about this, and so first off, he uses anesthesia, and he puts the dogs under anesthesia for surgery. He cuts a little what they're going to call a fistula, somewhere right in here where the arrow is pointing. And so it's going to be a tube. You can stick a rubber tube in there that's going to, the fistula is the opening. The tube is going to collect saliva. And you can see, you've got the little rubber tube here, and it's going to come down here to this little graduated cylinder. And then this cylinder is hooked up to some device that actually can record the number of milliliters of saliva that are coming out of the tube, and out of the plastic tube onto this little paper tube, and then this little pointer, this little stylus is going to move, and it's going to be able to record volume over time. And so you can know when is the dog salivating compared to other times. And the dog's in a harness. He's comfortable, but you don't want him really moving around when you've got a plastic tube stuck up into your throat. And here's an example of a plate of food that's being brought before him, and you can do this whole setup and put him in a harness, and they're very well cared for, and so on. And so, but the thing I want you to see from this is look at the extent to which the behaviorists would go to study a behavior and make it observable and quantifiable. And so clearly you're not going to be able to give a dog a survey and ask them how hungry they are on a scale of 1 to 10, but you don't need to do that here. And so you can make some inferences about hunger and saliva, especially in anticipation of food being brought to the animal over a period of time. And so we don't ask for self-report from human beings, or in this case the dog, about the amount you're salivating. They collect this saliva. And I think this is a really nice example of where this notion of salivation can be linked to other ideas like hunger, although true strict behaviorists wouldn't make that linkage. They would just trust that measuring the milliliters of saliva is good enough for us, and we're not going to make any greater leap beyond that. But I want to point out the notion that look at the effort that went into making this internal behavior, salivation, external. We can externalize it. We can collect the saliva droplets. We can record them on this moving paper. And so now we don't have to argue about how much saliva was there. Was there 5 milliliters or was there 7 milliliters? We've got a measure. We've got an externalized response. We can all look at it. It's publicly observable and it's quantifiable. And that really is, in many ways, the essence of what behaviorists are going to strive for as they study human behavior, again, from the 1920s well into the 1960s. And quite honestly, there are still vestiges of behaviorism with us today. In fact, there is a behavioral approach in psychotherapy. A lot of different behavioral approaches are still used. Systematic desensitization is one. Flooding would be another one. There's ABA, the analysis of behavior association. There's cognitive behavior therapy, and the behavior part comes from behaviorism. And so there are many influences of behaviorism still with us today. So here's just a classic, and there it is, the Pavlov 1927 reference to classical, or sometimes even called Pavlovian conditioning. And I won't get into this too much, but this is actually drawn this way on purpose. And so the CS bell precedes the meat powder. So you take a hungry dog and you put it in that harness like that, and if you were to take this meat powder, this little shaker, and shake it on the dog's tongue, the presentation of meat powder alone to a hungry dog will lead to salivation. This is called the UCS is the unconditioned stimulus. The UCR is the unconditioned response. So for a hungry dog, if you shake meat powder on its tongue, it's going to salivate. No one ever had to teach the dog this. This is unlearned, innate, hardwired, built in. And so meat powder leads to salivation. Now here's the deal with this notion of connectionism, or in this case, Pavlovian conditioning. You pair these two things. And so, by the way, if you were to walk up to a dog and ring a bell, that dog will not salivate to the sound of a bell, not without training. And so the bell has to become a conditioned stimulus. And so here's what happens. You pair these things. You pair this sequence of events over and over. So you ring a bell, meat powder, the dog will salivate. Bell, meat powder, salivation. Bell, meat powder, salivation. Bell, meat powder, salivation. Bell, meat powder, salivation. You think I'm stuck, don't you? Bell, meat powder, salivation. Bell, meat powder, salivation. Bell, meat powder, salivation. Bell. And all of a sudden, after about that many pairings over time, the dog will now learn that the bell is in anticipation of meat powder, which it has been on every other time before now. And then the dog will learn to, when it hears a bell ring, it will salivate. This is outside of the control. The dog doesn't say, "Hey, I think I'm going to salivate." This is a learned response, or what Pavlov is going to call a conditioned response. And so now that bell can elicit salivation. And all it took were some CS-UCS pairings. It took some conditioning. It took some connections being made between this stimulus and this response. And there it is again. You can see SR. The stimulus, the response. The S here, the stimulus, the response. And so now the next day you ring the bell. Forget about the meat powder now. You ring the bell and the dog will salivate. Now that response can strengthen and weaken over time, and that's a great topic for the learning course. You can get into stimulus discrimination and response strength and intensity and all that kind of good stuff. So really, what I want to leave you here, just as a kind of a precursor to behaviorism, is that the key to classical conditioning is that the stimulus elicits the response. The organism doesn't have to do anything or behave in a certain way. So the dog doesn't do anything to get fed the meat powder. And so this isn't like operant conditioning where you got to do something to get something in return. This is a different type of stimulus response association. And so the key is that the stimulus becomes paired with something that's meaningful, which also leads to a meaningful response. And eventually, over time, it is the stimulus that will elicit a conditioned response. Now, let me just tell you to make this distinction here. We won't get too much into the details here. And so plain old meat powder will lead to salivation. Eventually, a bell paired enough times with the UCS will lead to salivation. These look the same, but they're not. And so typically, the amount of saliva in milliliters would be less to a bell than it would be to actual meat powder. And so it's the same type of response, but the intensity or response strength will not be the same. Typically, to a UCR, an unconditioned response, to a CR, a conditioned response. And so by the way, human beings are just as susceptible to this. We learn a lot in our environment by these types of associations. And so you are not, when you're born, you do not born with the knowledge that green means go and red means stop. And in fact, we could really mess with somebody pretty badly. What if you raised your child to just the opposite? That red means go and green means stop. In fact, it's so odd I have to actually stop and think about it to say it wrong on purpose. So think about it. You're at a stoplight, you're driving to and from school or work or wherever. It is the green light that elicits the response for you to take your foot from the brake onto the accelerator. And so we learned associations that green means to stop at a stoplight, and I'm sorry, I said it wrong. Green means to go at a stoplight, and red means to stop at a stoplight. All right, and so we are governed by these stimulus response associations. We learn a lot about our environment from classical conditioning. There's all kinds of great examples about one trial learning, and there's the Garcia effect and all kinds of stuff with radiation and chemotherapy, and really some great examples that I hope that you'll remember from your learning course, or at the very least from your Introduction to Psychology course in the learning chapter.